Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Philly Factor. I'm your host, Paul Perrello. I think it's safe to say that Philadelphia is a very diverse city. And with that diversity comes a plethora of sandwich shops. Whether you're looking for a hoagie, whether you're looking for a cheesesteak, whether you're looking for a roast pork or roast beef sandwich, and many more sandwiches that are out there, you're going to find it in Philadelphia, if anywhere. That leads me to my next guest. Mike Madaio is the author of A History of Philadelphia Sandwiches, Steaks, Hoagies, Iconic Eateries, and More. And Mike, I want to thank you for being with us on this edition of the Philly Factor.
Thank you for having me, Paul. Appreciate it.
Just the cover alone makes my mouth water for whether it's a cheesesteak, whether it's Danick's roast pork and beef, whether it's Levis's hot dogs. I mean, no matter where you go in Philadelphia, Mike, I think you would agree that really there is something for everyone that's out there in the city.
Yeah, I mean, I one of the reasons I wanted to write this was because I really feel like, having traveled around, I mean, obviously you can get good sandwiches in lots of places, but like it's just so ingrained in the culture here and all throughout the city. There's so many interesting different takes on different sandwiches. So it really felt like a topic that was rife to be explored.
Yeah, and a topic, needless to say, that perhaps has been explored previously in newspaper articles and magazines, but I'm not sure there is a book as extensive as your book in terms of really getting into all of the humble beginnings of many of the sandwich shops that still to this day, and we're talking decades-long sandwich shops that grace street corners. So you've done a wonderful job in really capturing the essence of all these different eateries, and I'm sure you could probably have included many, many more that either exist or maybe faded away with time and history. But I'm not aware of any other book that really has gotten such a cross section of all these different sandwich shops around Philadelphia.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like, obviously the scene is constantly evolving, right? And even since the book has um, launched, there's a few interesting tidbits of news that changed some of the things. So there's always different things. There's always new places popping up. But to write a book about it, I decided to focus kind of on, as you said, the origins and really why sandwiches became something so that it wasn't just here are the top 10 to eat right now.
Mhm.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's always interesting too, but to try to come at it from a slightly different angle where you're looking at a little bit more about the history and the origins and the traditions that have lasted over time and really
Yeah.
focusing on that particular angle.
We should mention that you're not a native Philadelphian, and there's a reason that I bring that up because oftentimes, I mean, whether you're in South Philly, Northeast Philly, West Philly, up in Mount Airy, East Mount Airy, everybody's got their own favorite sandwich and sandwich location. You being an outsider, then, were able to look at this diverse landscape and really be objective, if you will, about what's out there. I mean, being an outsider looking in, you have a better perspective than someone like me, a kid from South Philly, who has, my favorite spots to go in South Philly, if you will.
Yeah, and I mean, I've lived in this area for a while, so I probably have a little bit of a bias in there too. But yeah, I mean, I tried to look at it without any particular homer status, and there's a couple comments online about the book, which I appreciate, which said, it's clear this author doesn't have a particular stake in the game, and that made it feel like it was a little more objective. So I appreciated that for sure.
Yeah. Um, Probably if there were the top five questions that I'm asked, and I've been doing this a long time and I've interviewed many, many, many people, when an outsider comes to town, one of the five questions that I get, well, number one is, where are the Rocky Steps? Where is the Rocky statue? And another one, the question that I get is, where could I find the best cheesesteak? And that is sort of like a powder keg because you don't want to necessarily pit one against the other. But if you're coming to Philadelphia, whether you're a politician, whether you're an actor, whether you're a director or producer. I mean, you're coming to Philadelphia, and probably the number one thing you want to get to eat is a cheesesteak. And of course, there I call them the tourist traps that are out there because everybody that comes to town flocks to these two places. But there are so many other cheesesteak shops in Philadelphia. And I'm not going to put you on the spot and say, give me your
A
favorite.
lot of people do.
I'll be kind because I don't want to necessarily make life miserable for you. But right at the top, it's Geno's and Pat's. Everybody seems to migrate to those two places. But once you get out of that tourist location in South Philadelphia, there are many other great sandwich locations around town that are equal to, if not better than, sometimes than the two shops that I just mentioned. I think you would agree.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's funny because you'll see online someone will say, "Where should I go for cheesesteak?" Pat's or Geno's, and someone will come and say, "Don't, they're tourist traps, they stink, blah 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 blah." But I think it's an experience to go to those places, especially if you go there late at night on the weekend or
Yeah,
something. But it's a fun place to go, and experience the culture, and obviously like the history is there and so forth. But yeah, I mean, obviously there are many other places that make great cheesesteaks. I mean, I think what's so interesting about cheesesteaks in particular is that all throughout the city and even beyond, in the suburbs, you go to a pizza place or a deli or a poppy shop or whatever, and you can get a decent cheesesteak, But then if you leave this area, I mean, I think there are more and more cheesesteak places opening up in other places, and maybe some of them are passable, some of them maybe not. Um, but certainly not, in a suburban pizza place. You're not in Milwaukee. You're not probably not gonna get a good cheesesteak.
for sure. Yeah. Um, we're focusing on the cheesesteaks, but of course, the Philadelphia area is known for much more than cheesesteaks. And if we were to go back in time, and I know you've done extensive research on this, but what came first, the roll or the cheesesteak? I mean, what came first? And if you look at one of the earlier offerings in the book, Levis's, I mean, here was a hot dog place in South Philadelphia that has stood the test of time in terms of being one of those locations, one of those spots. But was it before the what was before the cheesesteak? Was it the hot dog? Was it the hoagie? And we'll get into the genesis of the hoagie too, and where the name perhaps came from. But is Levis really one of the earliest spots that popped up on the scene in Philadelphia?
Well, so street food goes back to the origins of Philly, and you had not necessarily sandwiches, but pepper pot soup and hand pies and things of that nature. So even in the 1600s, and this isn't, I mentioned it in the book, it's not something I did a lot of research on, but just to try to understand that, it was a city with lots of people and lots of industrialization over time and so forth and so on. So, I mean, certainly you had different types of street foods. Then the Germans came in and you started to see soft pretzels and bakeries where you did have, interesting bread, different types of bread and so forth.
Mhm.
And then you had the next wave of Italian immigrants kind of started in the late 1800s. Um, but that's also the time, yes, that Levis started up, I think 1895, 1896, started selling hot dogs. I mentioned this in the book, there's some occasional claim that Levis invented the hot dog. I couldn't really find anything to substantiate that, but certainly one of the early places that was really successful in selling those and the fish cake alongside it, which I before I started researching this book, I had never tried before. That was a
Mhm.
really interesting thing. I mean, it's not something that you see a lot of anymore, although there are certainly a few places where you can still get the hot dog fish cake combo.
Mhm.
An interesting sandwich to try that
Sure.
not some locals don't haven't even tried, um but yeah, so that started out, and then I think if you go to Pat Olivieri, who is the originator of the cheesesteak. He was a hot dog stand and he sold hot dogs. And, as the story goes, one day he decided to fry up some steak on the hot dog grill and add some onions. And I, at least the best I could tell was the roll was, an Italian loaf that he would cut up and serve a few hot dogs on as kind of his large hot dog. So that's a way that hot dogs kind of directly led um, into the cheesesteak. And it's interesting because hot dogs, there was really a lot of history of hot dogs. There was the fish cake combo, there was Levis's, there was Lenny's, and then there was the Texas Wiener with the Greeks um, in South Philly. And so a fair amount of history, but the hot dog is not really a big thing anymore in the city. I mean, obviously you can still get one, but it's definitely not considered a specialty anymore, like it might be in Chicago or something.
Hmm, interesting. So what is the um, what is the specialty then? I mean, we kiddingly talked about Pats and Geno's, but when what always gets me is that people say, "Well, I was in California and I had a great Philly cheesesteak," and I'm like, "Okay, well, there's two things going on. Someone came to Philadelphia and tasted and decided they're going to open that shop in on the West Coast, or it's a transplant from Philadelphia to the West Coast, or they're just purely by luck making their own version of their cheesesteak." But what are we known primarily for today? Is it still the cheesesteak, or they're and perhaps there's a pizza book in your future there, because pizza shops are like, someone said to me, again coming from South Philly, why is there no Pizza Hut in South Philadelphia? And I'm like, are you kidding me? Why would they put a Pizza Hut in South Philly where there is a pizza shop on every street corner? Why would you do that? But maybe I'm giving you an idea for your next book. But what is Philadelphia known then when it comes to sandwiches today? Is it still the cheesesteak?
Yeah, I definitely think it is. I mean, it's interesting. So two things. One is that I would say that, until the 80s or 90s, it was probably more of a local dish. And I think that in the 90s, you saw the rise of like Food Network and Travel TV, Travel Channel, and like
Hmm.
they would have these, food shows where, they would love to go to a thing like Pat's and Gino's and show the rivalry and all that. And then, of course, the internet blew up, and that really changed the way people looked at food. And certainly a lot of these local foods became more well known. And the cheesesteak is, as I sort of said before, is available in a lot of different places now. Sometimes it's called steak and cheese or whatever, but it's and better versions, at least from what I've heard, are becoming more common. Um, Now, I sort of make no I don't try to hide the fact in the book that I'm a roast pork guy. Like I love the roast pork.
Hmm.
Um, I do think, it's so complex. It's such an interesting sandwich. And I think that, there are both journalists and just regular people who talk about if they've tried both say, the roast pork is clearly the better sandwich. Um, Showing my bias there, but like I think what's interesting is that the roast pork is a little bit more complicated, right? I mean, you have to slow roast a pork shoulder, you have to get the spices right. It's such a delicious sandwich when it's done right, but it's not something that you can just throw on the grill and in a couple minutes like a cheesesteak or deli slices like a hoagie. So I think it's not as widely available. It's more of a specialty item. And the chicken cutlet is probably the same, right? These are things that
Hmm.
require a little more culinary expertise. And so they're a little bit more specialty sandwiches. But I think if the cheesesteak and the hoagie bring you in and then you sort of discover some of these other ones, you can see that there are really some amazing
Yeah.
options out there.
Let's talk about the hoagie and where the hoagie came from. I mean, and this will probably be debated, for hundreds of years to come. The hoagie, when you look at it and what's on the roll, it's known as a grinder, it's known as a sub. I guess every city has their version of the hoagie, but yet you talk to some people in Philadelphia and they say, well, this place was responsible for the hoagie, or the hoagie has ties to the people that used to work down at the Navy Yard or Hog Island, shipyard. Then that's where it came from. But really, at its basic um, roots, I mean, what is a hoagie? What makes a hoagie, and where did it come from?
I mean, there are definitely people in Philly who will argue that a hoagie is different than a sub or a hero or a grinder. I mean, I'm of the belief that they're all the same basic idea. They're deli
Right.
meats on a long roll. Submarine, maybe because of Subway, maybe because of something else, has kind of become the term that people in the most places know, whereas hoagie is still a little more specific to this area. Although, as you said, people from here go other places and maybe open a hoagie shop or whatever. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if you look at the Italian American immigrants coming over, there really are pockets that created essentially the same type of sandwich all over the place. I mean, New York City, not surprisingly, Philly, Boston. In New Orleans, you had the muffaletta and the po' boy. There
Mhm.
was a guy up in Maine who made an Italian sandwich pretty early on, like around 1900. That's very similar. So there, I think we as humans have this sort of desire to have this inventor, this stroke of genius that this person came up with this amazing idea. But looking into it, it seems that, back in Italy, these folks ate a lot of these cured meats and cheeses and vegetables, probably on a plate, at a more formal lunch or dinner kind of situation, maybe with some bread on the side. But when they came over to the United States and they didn't have as much time to sit and eat the way they
Mhm.
might have when they were farmers, they put it all together on a sandwich, a really hearty, thing that would sustain you over the course of a hard day of working. And that, happened all across the East Coast, I think, kind of in parallel, as
Yeah.
opposed to being this one sort of point of entry. The first person to sell what we would become considered hoagies, I think, was probably D. Costanza's in Chester in this area, meaning in the 1920s. It doesn't mean I'm sure people were making them maybe at home, but the first person to really successfully sell them was probably that. And then, um, at least from a documentation standpoint in Philly, it's probably the mid 30s that you started to see people successfully selling these sandwiches.
I know there was a place that brought in more in South Philadelphia, Emil's, that laid claim to the fact that they
Yeah,
uh,
for
they were
sure.
the creator of. I guess who's to argue with these people because they lived decades, if
Yeah,
not 100
right.
years ago. So I mean, who's to argue with them? But I mean, how were you able to conduct your research? Because this is no small task. Because kiddingly, we said there's a sandwich shop on practically every corner, and everybody's got their own version of how and where the sandwich came from. So, how were you able to take the deep dive into this topic, if you will, to put together this book?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting too because a lot of it is oral history, and so there's not a lot of documentation. And
Sure.
so, I mean, I'm thinking of an interview with Antoinette Iannelli, who was at Emil's. She sort of said, "Well, I didn't write down when I started selling. I just this is what I remember,"
Yeah.
and that's the truth. I mean, you had these immigrants. They, were probably not all that well educated. They were not keeping careful documentation of what they were doing. Um, Now, there's a lot of newspaper research that you can do and menus, and occasionally there are things you can find. And so my goal was, again, we talked about this earlier, to be as objective as possible and not sort of buy into anyone's story. But to your point, these legends have to be told. And so I think it's more like, well, this is what Iannelli said, or this is what Pat Olivieri said about the cheesesteak. Can I always confirm that it's exactly true? No, but if you can get a couple different people kind of corroborating the same story, you can say, oh, this is probably the case. Or like you mentioned the Hog Island thing with hoagies. I mean, Hog Island was in operation from 1916, 17 to about 1921. And the first written reference to the term hoggy, which is the precursor to hoagie, was 1940. So, like the fact that there's a huge gap there suggests that maybe there's not a connection, even though everyone says that there is.
Sure.
So I try to highlight things like that. That again, it's not definitive, but it helps you say, okay, here's where I can be definitive, and here's where I can say, okay, here's the evidence for this, and here's the evidence for that.
What in your research and in your opinion, what makes these iconic sandwich shops that are still in existence today? I mean, what is the secret to their success? Is that they really didn't mess with the recipe for all these years? I mean, because we kiddingly say there's a sandwich shop on every corner, but for every new sandwich shop that opens up, there's probably just as many that don't make it and probably don't succeed and they close up. They gave it a shot and they closed up. So, what do you think is the key to the success of these iconic brands and shops that are out there today?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting one because and to your point, like there's probably just as many that went by the wayside over time that we have completely forgotten about.
Sure.
Certainly the ones that are still around kind of get to craft like Pat's gets to craft the legend, even if there was someone else back then that may have been forgotten. I mean, I think it's a combination between sticking to that tried and true, but one of the things I talk about, and this is more about like deli type places, but like places that were started out as corner grocery shops, in the teens or 20s or 30s or something like that, that kind of pivoted. So, you know, at that time you had these corner stores that people would shop at every single day. Then places like Acme and A&P came in and kind of took over the corner store and
Mhm.
then became supermarkets and so forth, and eventually ran out the butchers and the delis and the places like that. But there were a few places that was really interesting, like Ricci's and Cosme's and Campo's, that were started out as like grocery stores or butcher shops on the corner, eventually started selling sandwiches, and now they're like sandwich shops. They don't do any of the old stuff. So they were able to pivot kind of along with as the city evolved around it, which I thought was a really fascinating thing and allowed them to stick around. Whereas I'm sure there are, many, many others that did not make that,
Mhm.
but pivoting to sandwiches was something that allowed them to keep the business running, which is really interesting.
In a few minutes that we have left here, what has been the reaction to your book? I mean, because as I said, people have their favorites, they have their go-tos. And then when you come out with a book like this that really, opens the eyes of so many people, whether you're local or not, what has been the reaction from people to your book?
I mean, it's been positive. I think the one thing I've gotten a couple of comments on is on the cover. There's Pats and Geno's, right? And people say, "Why do you have them on?" Well, it's the history of the cheesesteak. You cannot talk about the history of the cheesesteak without Pats and Geno's.
Sure.
But as I said, I tried to be objective and not necessarily say, "Well, this is the best," right? I mean, I do talk a little bit at the end about what the current trends are and where things are moving. But again, I try to just provide examples and say, here's an example of, some, more modern takes on the cheesesteak, or, types of sandwiches from other parts of the world that have found a home here and things of that nature. And so it's, it's not, it, I didn't try to make it, these are the best places to go. I think you absolutely can check out the places that are mentioned in the book and use that as a guide of sorts. But it does, if a place wasn't mentioned, it doesn't mean it's not good, right? It just means it's not necessarily wasn't necessarily required to tell the story of the history of the sandwich.
In the 3 minutes we have left, and we could go on and talk another half hour here about your book and everything that's in there. But this is not a cookbook by any stretch of the imagination, although you do offer up some recipes in the book. And what made you decide to throw some recipes in there?
Yeah, I mean, I was able to find some interesting ones historically, like there's Pat's had given its recipe to one of the local papers at one time, and I thought that was really interesting. So shared a few things like that. The Shanks and Evelyn's, which is no
Hmm.
longer around, although Shanks Pier 40 is sort of tangential business, but they gave their roast pork technique, and then a couple other things like things that people might not be as aware of, like the salmon cheesesteak, which was a surprising find, or the pepper hash, which was a topping that went along with the hot dog combo that we talked about.
Um, this book is a must-have, whether you are from Philadelphia or not, or know someone that used to live in Philadelphia and they would like to get a copy of this book. It is available online. It is a history of Philadelphia sandwiches, steaks, hoagies, iconic eateries, and more. And I can't put it down. It's a must-read. It's a must-have. And whether you are looking for a place to eat or just looking to find a little bit about the backstory of the favorite places that you like to eat, you're going to find it in this book. And Mike, I want to thank you for your time. It's a great book. So, might there be a book about pizza shops in your future?
I don't know what I'm going to do next. Pizza is an interesting one. I mean, I think we talk about this a little bit in the book. I talked about it with Craig Laban from the Inquirer. Is like a lot of the Italian American energy has gone into hoagies and steaks and stuff. Pizza's been a little bit of an afterthought, but I think in the last decade or so, that's definitely changed a lot. So who knows? There's also some really interesting sort of old school Italian restaurants in town. So yeah, we'll see.
All right. Mike, thanks so much for being with us. Great job on the book. And we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thanks.
I appreciate you having me, Paul.
All right. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us on this edition of the Philly Factor. I'm your host, Paul Perrello. We'll catch you next time around.